our exhibits. The operation of the museum, though, putting on our exhibits, programs and everything, that comes through your membership and donations to the museum. So again, if you would love to donate a little something to us anytime you visit, that'd be marvelous. And also become a member. Just a quick reminder, please, make sure you signed in our visitor log either down here or upstairs. That documents people actually visit us. Good time to put your cell phone on mute. Invariably, that'll go off. We'd love you to become a museum member if you haven't already. And just, again, donations. Just want to, again, highlight, he's a handsome-looking guy here. But anyway, Flint puts together all these marvelous exhibits for us.
And my committee.
And his committee. Well, we just do the labor. He does all the design and everything. We also have a marvelous art exhibit in the hallway, which has been up for quite a while now. And if you haven't seen it, please go down and look at it. It's the artwork of Noah Webb, who was a young infantryman in Vietnam. And when he came back, he became quite interested in art and became quite a noted painter. And we had a whole exhibit of his work of topics which were kind of brought to him by his experiences in Vietnam. And now we have another set of his artwork showing a much broader range of interest. And his wife, Char, is here, up all the way in the back, Char, who's a marvelous volunteer with us as well. We only have one more coffee and conversation for this year, and I hope you'll join us for that. And lo and behold, it's on December 7th. In the past, we've normally had something related to the attack itself, but we realized there were actual 2 Broomfield residents who served on the USS West Virginia at different times. Pete Peterson was a young sailor on the USS West Virginia at Pearl Harbor when it was sunk. And then later, Don Seibel, Naval Academy graduate, served on the USS West Virginia once it was rebuilt and deployed out to the Philippines, and was on it during the Battle of Surigao Strait. And we're fortunate to have the daughters of both of those who will join us for there. So we'll first kind of have a short talk on the history of the USS West Virginia, and then both Diana and Nancy will talk about their father. So I think it's a marvelous way to kind of end up the year. And the model we have upstairs, which Flint just talked about, the USS Colorado. The USS West Virginia looked exactly like the USS Colorado. So that's what the ship looked like at Pearl Harbor when it was sunk. So without further ado, let me call up, and Don, I'll turn it over to you, and then you'll get the more important talk following his.
Got to include those. We got to include those combat engineers.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll get that out of here.
How's everybody doing today?
Yeah.
Great. Good. Great to hear. While Mike's going ahead and pulling this up, I did want to start off with saying something that Mike and I were both in agreement with about this talk. And with the 80th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge coming up here on December 16th, one of the things that we wanted to give a little bit of attention to was some of the lesser known units. We've always heard during the Battle of the Bulge about the very famous combat units, 101st Airborne Division, 82nd Airborne Division, the 10th Armored Division, all these fighting GIs. But I do remember a very interesting story that was told to me when I was in my advanced infantry training in the Army. And I went to an AIT. I was not combat arms. I was not a combat MOS. So I went to a non-combat MOS AIT. And while I was there with guys who were, training to be truck drivers, cooks, medics, engineers, mechanics, clerks, all kinds of people like that. And we were out on an FTX once, and this was in Missouri. And we're digging into the hard Ozark soil with our entrenching tools. We're digging a foxhole, and we're filling sandbags and this kind of stuff. I remember one of my buddies in the foxhole next to me turns to the drill sergeant and opens his mouth, which is always a bad idea, right? And he asks a question. He says, I'm going to be a clerk. I joined the Army to type on a typewriter and work on computers and things like that. Why do I need to know this stuff? I'll never forget that drill sergeant just kind of leaning over at him like this in that foxhole and saying, let me tell you a little story, son. It's about the Battle of the Bulge. And during the Battle of the Bulge, when so many combat units were knocked back reeling by this German attack, this massive German attack, in many of these depots, these small little villages in Belgium, as the German assault is making more and more traction, as it's gaining more ground, it's up to these little units of cooks and clerks and truck drivers and ammunition stockers and logistics men and medics and combat engineers to do the fighting. And that's when they had to pick up a rifle. Some of them hadn't picked up a gun since basic training. And some of them hadn't thrown a grenade except for once in basic training. And all of a sudden, they are now the front line. But the fact that we did train, and we still do, train every soldier in the Army, regardless of MOS, as an infantryman first, is one of the things that I think helped save the day during that battle. So that was one of the reasons why Mike and I wanted to kind of take a look at these, pardon me, different units here today. And let's go to next. That'll get me out of here. There we go. But some background first for those of you who aren't aware, and I know Flint had already given you a little bit of background here. What was the Battle of the Bulge? Well, this was Hitler's last final gamble. It was the Nazis' desperate effort to attack Western Europe and change the tide of the war. Now, this is 1944. Remember, the United States has already come in. The Allies have already invaded Normandy in D-Day. And we have already gained a lot of ground, a lot of territory we've recaptured in France, all the way up to Belgium, the German border, the Siegfried Line. And during that time period, we would see that Hitler is so desperate that he actually does some wild and crazy stuff that the Americans were not expecting in order to initiate this final offensive and try to change the outcome of the war. We know it was fought in freezing winter conditions. This was one of the worst winters in Europe, in Central Europe, in over 50 years. A massive German assault came through the Ardennes forest, which is in Belgium, aimed at U.S. forces who are on the frontier, and it caught most of those forces by surprise. And we'll explain why we were caught by surprise.
Don, could you kind of dim these lights because of the glare of the lights?
Okay, well, I'm not in charge of the lighting, but maybe somebody.
Could you ask somebody to?
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Don, stand
Yeah.
kind of behind the podium,
Sure.
so you'll show up.
Okay. It was the largest battle. A lot of people don't realize it's the largest battle for the United States Army in World War II, officially referred to as the Ardennes Offensive, but it came to be known more popularly as the Battle of the Bulge. And we'll also explain that, although I think it's very apparent to a lot of people when you take a look at a map as to the bulge in the lines and why it kind of got that name. So what were the Germans trying to do here? What was Adolf Hitler trying to do here? Well, one of the things was, after the successful invasion of Europe, Adolf Hitler wanted to reverse Germany's losing streak. And at this point, I think Hitler was, although quite delusional, I think he at least had an idea that the war was not going in his favor. And he wanted to see if he could end the war on his terms without having to deal with unconditional surrender. There would be conditions attached. He might be able to hold on to a certain amount of Europe if he could go ahead and turn fortune in his favor. Now, here's a big one. And this one has kind of come to light a lot. There's been a lot of reasons given for why Hitler did this. And this one, it's nothing new, but there's been a lot more that historians have been writing about this, which I think is a huge contributing factor. And that was the fact that Hitler needed to demonstrate to the Allies that he still was a fighter. In other words, the German army was not defeated yet, because there was a strong belief amongst the Americans, all the Allies at this point, that basically Germany was on the ropes. And the war would be over in just a matter of days. There was always this old, the war will be over before Christmas type of thing. So if he could, in fact, make an attack that was strong enough to cause significant casualties, to gain back some ground, even if it was in the end not necessarily a success completely, he could make it appear that any sort of continued combat with Nazi Germany was going to inflict more cost than it was worth. In other words, the invasion of Germany itself, the Reich, would be too costly. And then he negotiates on his own terms. And then, as some of you probably know, one of the reasons he wanted to end the war in the West on his terms is because who was his biggest threat? Yes, the Soviet Union. If he was able to come to some sort of peace terms with the Allies in the Western Front, then he could direct his attention to the Soviet Union in the East. The name of this assault is called Wacht am Rhein, which is actually in itself kind of deceptive because it just simply translates to watch on the Rhine River. So Hitler wanted to put out some sort of propaganda, if you will, some sort of misconceptions that the Germans were only involved in defensive work at this point in the war. They could not put together an offense. And nothing sounds more just kind of like sitting on your butt, right? Defensively, than watch on the Rhine, So that's one of the reasons why it was codenamed that. In September of 44, he gets together with a bunch of his generals. They start planning this. Now, one of the big questions that has come around for a lot of people is in 1944, how did he have all of this material to fight and create this huge offensive? As a matter of fact, General Omar Bradley, there's a very famous quote from him. During the Battle of the Bulge, he actually says, after the battle takes place, he's looking at a map, and he's kind of stroking his chin, and he says to one of his aides, "Where in the hell did this guy get all this stuff?" That's a quote from Omar Bradley. Where he got all this stuff, where Hitler got all this stuff, was actually remarkable. This required over 13 German infantry divisions, 7 armored divisions, many other smaller units, close to 400,000 men, 2,000 plus tanks, tank destroyers, self-propelled guns, other vehicles, as well as over 4,000 artillery pieces. Well, he had been saving up a lot of gear ever since June 6, ever since D-Day, when he knew that this was going to be something he was going to have to do. He had transferred certain units from the Eastern Front. At this exact time, the Eastern Front had kind of bogged down with the Soviet Union a little bit, so he had the liberty of going ahead and taking some of those infantry and armor units from the east and moving them west. They had actually put the German industry on high productivity. All the factories are cranking out ammunition and weapons and everything. As a matter of fact, this caused, after the Battle of the Bulge, it caused the United States Army Air Force to reconsider the massive strategic bombing plan. Because when they took a look at what he had been able to produce just prior to Wacht am Rhein, they were starting to question whether they were really having an impact on German industry. So that gives you a clue right there. He was able to reconfigure units that had lost a lot of men and equipment and material, like in the East and fighting through France, by taking a whole bunch of those non-soldiers in the German Wehrmacht and putting them into frontline units. These would be all of those support people we'd talked about, clerks, ammunition carriers. He took a large number of the Kriegsmarine, that was the German Navy, because some of you probably realize by 1944, the German Navy practically no longer existed. He was able to take sailors, and all of a sudden, instantly, you go from being a sailor to being a soldier. Luftwaffe men, and this one figured pretty big in our story, various guys who were in charge of fueling the airplanes, working on the engines on the aircraft. Because remember, also, the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, is not really a big deal anymore at this time either. So he's able to impress a lot of them into the actual infantry. and then feed them into these divisions who had lost so many casualties in the East. So there was an incredible amount of secrecy with all of this, as you can imagine. He had required all of his top generals to sign a secret agreement, which said if you disclosed any of this to any of your lower command structure, or to anybody outside of the circle of him and his generals, that it was punishable with death. So that had a pretty big impact on his generals, as you can imagine. The buildup, as we said, was disguised as a defensive preparation. There's no way you can disguise all of this. So the idea is if some of this gets out, this massive buildup prior to this offensive, that we can go ahead and put out information that we are basically just creating a massive defensive wall along the Siegfried Line for what Germany was anticipating in the spring of 1945 would be the Allied invasion of the German frontier, of Germany proper. So if we make it look like we're just doing defensive work here, then the Allies probably won't care, was what they were thinking, when actually they are planning an offensive. The Germans knew that the Ardennes was considered to be a quiet sector. So Hitler says, this is the place where we'll plan this attack. This is where it's going to happen. We know that most of the American units along there are resting and refitting. And some of them had been involved in a lot of combat since D-Day, through France, through parts of Belgium, all the way up to the frontier of Germany, the Hürtgen Forest. So a lot of those units need to rest, refit, and recover. Also, coincidentally, at this time, there are several large divisions coming in who are brand new and green, just being shipped over from the United States for this final attack into Germany in spring. But these guys have seen no combat, okay? But they're all positioned along this part of Belgium. So Hitler says, that's where we're going to hit them. Clues. A lot of people say, well, how come the United States didn't know this was going to happen? It seems like it would be big enough to figure out. We did. Many of the units that were posted along the border there with Germany, we had reconnaissance units, we had various units that were kind of holding the line in position. They had sent out patrols, they had sent out scouts, and most of those soldiers had said, yes, we've seen stuff going on. We've seen an increase in traffic on the roads. We've seen a lot more German tanks than we had ever seen. And they actually had a couple of Belgian civilians come to them and say, hey, guess what's in my town? Lots of Nazis. So they knew this was going on. The problem really becomes when that starts to go up the chain of command. That information starts to go up the chain of command from your first lieutenant to your captain, to your major, to your colonel, and on up to the high command, the generals and everything. And they kind of poo-poo it and they say, there's no way. The Germans can't do this. They're on the ropes. This is what you're just seeing as they're just preparing for when we attack in spring. Okay? So unfortunately, it was the high command who really kind of let down the field command at this point in the American Army and couldn't believe that something like this was going to happen. Yeah. And then finally, of course, as we know, November, December, as I mentioned, really bad weather. So it wasn't like you could send out a lot of reconnaissance, especially aerial reconnaissance, because with all of the overcast, they weren't going to get much pictures of anything except clouds. So, yeah. The plans, well, just in a brief nutshell, this was going to involve three major German armies. In the northern part, you had the 6th Panzer Army, and we're going to focus on that today. In the middle, you had the 5th Panzer Army, and then in the lower part, you had the 7th Army, which was basically just going to screen this attack. The idea was to drive as far as possible. As you can see, the goal there was Antwerp, and basically split the Allied forces and hopefully capture the town of Antwerp, because Antwerp was a major staging center and a port for Allied supplies that were coming in. So this was the idea. The plan was to get all the way there, but you can see with the little golden line there how far they actually were able to make it. And it wasn't far enough to be considered successful in any means. So the other unit that was involved, especially up here in the 6th Panzer's section, where they're driving towards Antwerp, were the infamous SS units. And some of those were particularly, as we know, ruthless, brutal groups of Nazis who had been indoctrinated from almost youth into the whole Nazi ideology of basically giving no quarter. One of those infamous units was the 1st Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, which was the bodyguard, originally Adolf Hitler's bodyguard. And this unit, there was a Kampf group or a battle group that was led by a particularly brutal lieutenant colonel by the name of Joachim Peiper. His name will come up later, but he was known in warfare on the Eastern Front for sparing no prisoners. His unit had gotten the nickname of the Blowtorch Battalion because he was known to go into Russian villages and basically take his flamethrowers in his unit and torch every human being and every structure until it was all just waste. So this guy, yeah, pretty ruthless. December 16th, the date that the attack is set for, all hell breaks loose along this front, which was, remember, previously a quiet front. American units were hit hard. There was a massive artillery bombardment all along those lines you saw. And then the German army started to move out straight into Belgium. In no time, they were driving through the Ardennes, just like it was a sieve, penetrating the forward American positions all along the lines. Allied commanders, some of them panicking, starting to think, holy cow, what is going on here? Some similar reactions as to American reactions on December 7th at Pearl Harbor. This was a surprise attack. And as these Germans start moving forward, as a steamroller, if you will, starts picking up speed, moving into Belgium, some of these American commanders, as they start to see their units break and fall apart in front of the German advance, they start to wonder, is this going to go all the way to Paris? Is this going to set the entire war back? Is it going to make it all the way to the Channel and reverse everything that we've been fighting for? And as you saw some of those photographs, you don't see a lot of this in the history books, but on occasion you do see photographs of American prisoners of war being marched away. I think the only other place I can think of where you see that many photographs is Bataan, right? Some of the images from Bataan. So that brings us to our story here and what we're going to touch on real quickly, and that has to do with this young officer here, and he was young, 20 years old. He had actually joined the National Guard when he was 14. Yeah, and that was back, of course, prior to the war, but he had worked his way up. He had gone to officer school, and he had become a first lieutenant of an intelligence and reconnaissance unit, platoon. I'm going to refer to that as an I&R platoon, okay? And this is just a very small unit of men. It was attached to the 394th Infantry Regiment. 99th Infantry Division was one of those divisions that was holding the line, that was relatively green or made up of new soldiers. On December 16th, he had 18 of his men in a platoon and then 4 men who were from, they were artillery observers from an artillery unit. And they were on this forested ridge overlooking the Belgian village of Lanzerath. Now, Lanzerath is almost right on the border of Belgium and Germany. So as you can imagine, it's going to be one of the first places hit when the Germans attack. Many of his men were graduates of the Army's ASTP. And if any of you have ever heard of the ASTP, I'm sure probably some of you have, it basically, I had it written down here, stood for Army Specialized Training Program. And towards the end of World War II, the U.S. Army starts to see a need for getting some more technically proficient soldiers into the military. So they start picking some of these guys out of like technical schools. Maybe they've completed a year of college. Maybe they have a particular skill in the civilian world. And they start kind of handpicking these guys and putting them through this program. There's quite a few volunteers as well. So most of his platoon is made up of guys like this. They have a little bit more of the education than the average GI. So he's got a good group of guys here. They're in a good position. They're dug in these foxholes along this kind of ridge line, overlooking this town, keeping an eye on things. But remember, this is not a combat unit. The whole job of an INR platoon is just to kind of be sneaky scouts and spy on things. See what's going on. Report back to headquarters how many Germans are in that village. Report back to headquarters when they find a prisoner and they can bring him in for interrogation. Report back to headquarters how many fuel trucks they see the Germans are driving into this area or that area. How many positions the Germans are picking out. So that's their whole job. These guys are really not frontline combat soldiers, but they do have combat equipment. They have rifles and machine guns and the assorted gear. They have two 30 caliber machine guns set up in their position, a 50 caliber, which they've taken from a Jeep. They have two Jeeps, they're kind of set back, and they had a little hut that was behind them that they were using as kind of a place to rotate the soldiers out of the foxholes where they could warm up, and then when it was their shift, they would go back into the foxholes. Because remember, the temperatures are getting pretty cold. Their position was less than 2 miles from the German border. So they are really in a good position to keep eyes on stuff. And because of that, they're some of the first to find out what's going on during this attack. So when that attack happens on December 16th, 05:30 in the morning, this artillery barrage falls all along their positions. Now they were pretty lucky because the Germans had basically calibrated their artillery to hit behind the positions. They did not figure that Bulge and his men would be so far forward. So most of the artillery kind of falls in the forest behind him and his men, so it really doesn't do much damage. But you can imagine it probably wakes them up pretty well, 5:30 in the morning. Yeah. As you can see, his quote here. Suddenly, without warning, a barrage of artillery registered at about 5:30 hours and continued until 7 o'clock. The artillery was relentless and frightening, but not devastating. Much landed short, wide, and long of our position, and mostly tree bursts. At any rate, our well-protected cover prevented casualties. He really had his men dug in. The telephone lines were knocked out, but our one radio allowed us to report to regiment. I called regiment and told them the TDs, those are tank destroyers, are pulling out. What should we do? The answer was loud and clear. Hold at all costs. Yeah. And there was a small unit of tank destroyers which was in this village of Lanzareth that you can see right here. This red arrow is the German advance where they're heading up. They want to head up this road to Loshheimergraben and Buchholz Station. They want to head this direction. Those are major U.S. supply areas. So as they're coming out of the German frontier here and they're heading into Belgium, they want to cut through the town of Lanzareth. These squares here you see are where his platoon had these foxholes dug up on this ridge. And there's a better illustration of this. There's actually an aerial photograph that was taken after the battle when the United States Army decided to study this action here that took place. And I'll show you even a better diagram too, but you can see a faint red arrow there is showing again where the Germans are coming up. So his men are in a good position up on that hill there, which is perfect for observation, also good for defense too.
What is Lanzareth?
Lanzareth was a tiny little village in Belgium.
No.
Oh, in the picture?
Is it there?
This is it, right here. Yeah, that's Lanzareth. So one of the big problems is initially that artillery barrage, although it doesn't really hurt any of his men, it destroys his field telephone line back to headquarters. Now the unit still has radio. So he hops on this radio and he starts asking, when are we going to get reinforcements? Everything's just breaking loose up here. Everything's going to hell. And what he kind of forgets during this entire time is that this is not just a small action taking place in front of him. When you're in the military, oftentimes we have what we call a foxhole eye view, and we sometimes think the only thing that's going on is that which is going on right in front of us, right? Well, in fact, this is a huge operation all along the American lines. But he's unaware of that at this point. He thinks they're just attacking him and his men. So he's calling back, he's saying, where are the reinforcements? But remember, his higher command is also in chaos. And they are panicking. And they are trying to figure out what's going on. And there's confusion. So he's not getting much of a way of a response. He's denied artillery support. He's denied reinforcements. So they just keep telling him, hold on, just hold your ground. Several of the men were actually in Lanzareth. They were actually in that town. In the photograph you saw there, they had set up a tiny little observation post. And while they were in there, the Germans come walking into the building. They were in the upstairs. The Germans come upstairs. And there's a famous story. One of the sergeants had hid himself in a closet. And one of the German soldiers is walking in the room. He can hear his footsteps. And he starts to take out a grenade. And he said he was going to pull the pin on the grenade and he was going to take himself and the German soldier with him. And the German soldier starts to open the closet and actually jams the door handle into his gut. And he said at that point he kind of barged ahead of the German and ran past him before the German could react. But he never had to use a grenade. He stuck the pin back in it. But that's where he was willing to go at that point. These men in this observation post manage to sneak out. They get up the hill because remember, it's still a little dark now at this time in the morning. And they manage to crawl up this hill back to the positions and they go ahead and report to Lieutenant Bulge and they tell him what's going on here. Now, there was a really interesting story that occurred, and I remember when I was there at Lanzareth, one of the historians, local historians, telling me about this. So Bulge is up there on this slope with his men, and he's watching these Germans just kind of filter through the town, lots of them. He recognizes that they are what they call Fallschirmjäger. That's German paratroopers. You can tell because the shape of the helmet is very different than the regular helmet that the Germans were known for. And he's a little worried about that because he's heard that the Fallschirmjäger are some of the elite of the German military. What he doesn't know, and his men don't know, is that we mentioned a lot of these were made up of Luftwaffe personnel that had been kind of drafted into the Fallschirmjäger. Probably a lot of them didn't even know how to use their guns. But it doesn't matter. He sees them coming, over 500 of them, walking up through this road. And he sees all of a sudden this Belgian girl come out of one of the buildings. She's about 13 years old. He said he remembered her kind of dirty blonde hair. She goes running up to the officer who's at the front of this group of soldiers and starts talking to her. And he's watching all this through his binoculars. And he notices all of a sudden that this Belgian girl points up to the hillside where they are. Now, there's been some interesting discussion about that, and this historian, when I was there at Lanzareth, was telling me about this. First off, you have to understand something about this part of Belgium. This part of Belgium has a huge Germanized population. A lot of them see themselves as being almost more German than they do Belgian. So could there have been some of these Belgian civilians who were in league with the Nazis or were helping the Germans out? Certainly. But the other thing is, many, many years later, somebody actually met this girl and asked her, what did you do there? What was going on? Her story, whether you believe it or not, was she said she simply was pointing out which way the tank destroyers had gone and retreated. So we may never know the truth as to whether she was, helping the Germans out or whether she was just innocently pointing to things or what. It doesn't matter, though, because Bulge himself is thinking, uh-oh, now something's really going to hit the fan, right? Yeah. And when the Germans attack, they start coming up this hill. As you saw, there's a big hill there with a barbed wire fence in front of it. Not much cover. And they think that this is strange. The Americans think this is weird because the Germans are all bunched up. They're standing up. They're just walking forward as if they were like in one of those old Civil War movies. And they're like, are these guys crazy? What is with these Germans? Yeah, here's a really good graphic that kind of shows, first off, it shows the blue here is where the tank destroyers kind of drove around the town and then retreated. And up here again is where the INR platoon is. And this is the way that the Germans are coming, like this. And it was about there where I think the girl came out and she pointed out. And Bulge is seeing that from here. So when I was there in 2019, it was really kind of interesting because all of a sudden while I was there, it was December, and this snowstorm started coming in. And it must have been very close to the actual conditions that happened in 1944. You'll notice that one of the things about winter in Belgium is there's a lot of mist and fog. And you can see the fog here setting in. It was almost impossible to see at times. Sometimes the fog was there, other times it lifted, it was gone. Then it'd be back a few minutes later. This is the monument, which a group of the people I was with on the tour were walking up to, and I'll show you a better picture of that later. This is the woods where the INR unit was, and the fields kind of slope this way down towards the town of Lanzereth. So they had pretty good cover in there, as you can see, at least concealment. And here is the road, and along this road here is where that girl pointed them out, or at least they believe she did. So as soon as these soldiers start marching up there, of course, the INR platoon opens fire on them. You've got two 30 caliber machine guns, you've got 50 caliber machine gun, you've got German soldiers just walking up in lines like this, right? And it's just a slaughter. They're shooting down the Germans left and right. As a matter of fact, there are multiple comments from the participants in the INR platoon. They were like, what were the Germans thinking? They were just idiots. These are not infantry tactics. Even some of the men who many years later felt quite guilty about this, because they felt it wasn't warfare, it was like murder. And they're shooting down more and more of these troops. And as they are coming up this hill, though, Bulge is still calling for reinforcements. And what he is getting is nothing, static a lot of times. He sends two runners back too. Those guys go back to headquarters, but they're unable to make it back to him. They're never able to make it back. German bodies are piling up in front of the position. None of his men have been hit yet. They're in these very careful foxholes, some of them with overhead cover, camouflaged. And many of the Germans are getting killed trying to crawl over this barbed wire fence. You can imagine how gory that must have been. Around 1100, 11 o'clock, the platoon's Jeep, the main radio and the 50 caliber were destroyed when the Germans finally got a little smart and brought in a little bit of artillery. They started using some mortars, and they hit those. Pretty soon he knew that the Germans would change their tactics. They wouldn't be stupid forever. Hours and hours maybe, but yeah, not forever. And he knew that they would probably try to outflank his position and get around it. And then he would be in trouble. That's when he sent these runners back to HQ, but he never really heard back from them. And here's kind of an extended version here. You can see the German unit coming here, coming up the hill as they tried to flank them later, flanking them over here later. Eventually, it's just a matter of numbers. When you only have 22 men against hundreds and hundreds of Germans, odds are not in your favor. By late afternoon, the Germans began to push more units east of his position to try and outflank him. He sent reports that he was still holding out, but a sniper shot their last radio. As a matter of fact, he mentioned that he actually had it up to his ear when a sniper shot it and basically blasted it apart. Well, there goes his last line of communication to headquarters. Ammunition was running low, as you can imagine. By evening, he finally ordered his men. He said, we've done all we can here. We've been fighting for 10 or more hours, holding off these Germans. He says, we got to get out of here. We're going to retreat back towards the headquarters at Hunningen. Just as he was giving that order, though, the Germans are on that eastern part, the flank, jumped up and made one final rush at his men in their positions, the foxholes, and overwhelmed them. And this is where finally they started to incur some casualties. Got real bad here because this is hand-to-hand, up-close fighting. Two of his men are wounded horribly. One of them, a German burp gun, one of those Schmeisser guns, point blank into this one poor fellow's face. Another has his jaw almost totally blown off by a grenade blast. Bulge himself is wounded in the leg. He said he was getting out to surrender. And the German who was taking him prisoner was about ready to shoot him. He was absolutely convinced the German was going to shoot him and kill him right there. And he said all of a sudden one of his men from another foxhole opened up, killed that German, but in the process also hit him in the leg because of the way they were standing. So he had a wound to his leg. Several of these men are seriously wounded, pretty bad, but they're forced to surrender. They're taken to a little tiny cafe, the Cafe Scholzen in Lanzareth, bleeding, injured, and honestly, they're quite surprised after the fight they put up and after all the emotions and everything that the Germans actually at that point start to take good care of them. They have a medic in there who's giving them, well, you know, the best treatment that a POW gets, you know. But at least they're taken into this cafe. They're bandaged up rudimentarily, and they're kind of set to the corner, and they have some guards standing over them. They're still, you know, don't know what the Germans' ideas are. The Germans may still decide to shoot them all. As we know from things like the Malmedy massacre, the German SS units especially were pretty cold-blooded when it took to taking prisoners. This was the cafe I saw when I was there in 2019. It's now called the Hexenkettel in Belgian. Well, actually, it's the Germanic Belgian. Anybody know what that means? Witch's cauldron. The witch's cauldron.
Which is out there.
Yeah. But it was a Cafe Scholzen at that time. It's now a yellow painted cafe, and it still exists. It's still there. So this guy Piper I was talking about, this SS commander, particularly nasty dude. His battle group is following behind this German assault, trying to get up this road. He's already had a lot of frustrations. There's been bridges that are blown out that the Germans actually blew up on their retreat back into Germany they forgot about. And so he's having to get these huge panzer tanks and everything from his armored column over these non-existent bridges and these gullies and rivers. So he's also finding other problems, mines that are laid in the roads by combat engineers. And he's trying to maneuver around all of this, and he's running late. And the timetable is very important for the Germans in this whole operation. It's very strict. And if he's off by any little bit, then this could jeopardize the entire offensive. So Piper arrives in Lanzareth. He's already angry, he's frustrated, he's encountered all these traffic jams too. That's the other thing. Germans are moving through roads. They have to take the roads because of those big tanks. And all these roads are just jammed up with vehicles. So he gets out and he walks into this cafe and he finds this commander of these paratroopers in his unit that was trying to take the hill and took the position there. And he just lays into him. You know, you and your men, because you didn't take this hill from a tiny little group of 22 soldiers or what, costing this entire offensive. And Bulge witnessed this. He didn't know who he was at that point. He didn't know it was Piper. But he said this guy came in there red in the face and just started lambasting into it. Now, he's pretty much the same rank as this guy. But you got to remember how the SS were. The SS always thought of themselves as superior to the regular Wehrmacht soldiers. And he was. To that extent, he kind of outranked Helmut von Hoffmann. Yeah. So, the long and the short of this was, Bulge and his men, the survivors, there was only one who was killed, which in itself was pretty remarkable, although most of them were heavily wounded. They all spent some time as prisoners of war, and that in itself was a huge ordeal. And I recommend, if you're further interested in this story, Alex Kershaw, as some of you know, wrote this up wonderfully in a book called The Longest Winter. And we do have a copy of this book here at the museum library, too, that you can check out. But he kind of goes into more of what happens with Bulge when he is taken as a POW, and his men are taken as a POW, too. It wasn't until much, much longer that the men received recognition, because Bulge himself thought that he had been a failure, that he had not been able to hold back this attack. And remember, he's just got that small, narrow viewpoint, so he thinks, oh, my unit was just jumped on by these Germans and wiped out, and we did nothing, and we surrendered, and yada, yada. But what he doesn't realize is that he was in the right place at the right time. And because of that, and because he held out for 10 plus hours, 12 hours or so, he held back this German attack, this assault. He was able to mess up the German offensive considerably. And those 12 hours were crucial. They could have made the entire difference between the Germans winning the Battle of the Bulge and losing the Battle of the Bulge, especially as Mike will tell you some more about here in just a few minutes. Final thing, though, was his unit finally did get some recognition later. I think it was around 1980. He had been interviewed himself, but he was always angry that his men never got much credit. So in 1980, he was interviewed, and they actually considered getting him and another soldier from his unit the Medal of Honor. But unfortunately, that kind of fell off. There were many Silver Stars that were awarded, DFCs, Bronze Stars for his platoon. His platoon becomes the most decorated for such a small unit in American history, in American military history, because of what they had done here. But again, an I&R platoon, not a group of combat soldiers, a group of guys who just decided they were going to stay and they were going to hold and fight for this position. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Mike.
You have a question, one or two questions?
Yeah, and then unfortunately I got to go. Go ahead.
One quick comment, I read where on Piper's advance, he went through a German minefield that he didn't know was there, and he lost 5 tanks in that German minefield.
Well, I know
Which
of
really
one.
added to his frustration.
I know of at least one tank. He drove a tank through personally. He ordered his men to drive a tank through the, yeah, that might be, yeah.
Well, it just showed the criticality of getting to, the Muse River bridges without any delay.
He didn't decide to go there
Well,
by
come forward.
himself.
Come
It
forward.
was
Oh, I
organized
get
by
this set up.
his upper.
Get your stuff.
Are you referring to Piper or Wolf?
I'm referring to the guy whose name starts with a B. Okay, the 18 men. So how was that organized? I mean, how I hear you saying it is he decided to do this, but he was
Well, he
ordered
decided,
to do this.
right, he decided to hold the position. Remember, he was told to hold at all costs.
Yeah,
But in the military, of course, that can be very problematic because what are all costs, And once his men were completely jumped and surrounded and captured and everything, he really had no choice. So it was his decision to hold at all costs. He was ordered, we could say he was ordered that. The position where he was at was a position that he had occupied for, I believe, a week. There were other positions along the line there where they had been kind of doing this reconnaissance and spying on the Germans. So they were ordered to those positions. But his choice, yeah, if you could say it was a choice, because some soldiers may not obey that order, hold at all costs, Or again, hold at all costs is kind of vague. After the first casualty, after the first hour, after the first time, the first assault by the Germans, yeah.
Piper was known to kill his prisoner later on. Well, I'm wondering how the 18 men survived.
Yeah.
Pure luck, pure luck.
And to tell you the truth, I've done a lot of reading on Piper and the SS, also because it was early on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So as he became, there's an interesting, and I'd love to do a whole talk on the atrocities during the Battle of the Bulge, but it's a pretty dark subject. But you could almost draw like a bar graph, and on that graph it could almost be like a curve, like a bell curve. And with the first SAS, they didn't do much in the way of the beginning assault, but as they got more and more frustrated, you start to see this killing of prisoners. And then towards the end, when they are trapped at places like Trois Ponts and Stoumont,
Well,
and areas
Chenot,
like that, he starts to realize that, well, wait a minute, and some of his men do too, his underlings, we're going to probably get captured soon, and this is failing. So then we'll have to stand trial for these atrocities. And then it starts to kind of taper off. But it wasn't just soldiers too.
Yeah,
There were a lot of
civilians.
Belgian civilians that were murdered too when his units came through because they hated a lot of the Belgians.
Wasn't Piper then hanged afterwards?
No,
No, it wasn't.
Oh, he wasn't.
Yeah,
no. He was exonerated, kind of, and interestingly, he retired to southern France and lived there. And what they say is he was probably killed at some point. He had a mysterious fire in his house which killed him.
They believe it was communist agents who burned him in his house, so yeah.
Okay,
But
well,
we
anyway.
could say that he kind of got his just desserts.
Yeah. But just a kind of continuation, you know, Don set the stage, you know, what really happened in the early hours, and actually how, you know, the great plan for the Germans got frustrated by isolated units who just didn't collapse but kind of stayed and fought as long as they could. What I wanted to highlight too is the next kind of phase is once Piper, and we're talking strictly now about the northern sector of this thing. Once he got further into Belgium, he was frustrated again. And I'd like to at least give a little credit to combat engineers, who in many cases were the sole unit that was left sitting around, essentially setting up roadblocks on critical bridges and crossings. And the two units I just wanted to highlight is the 291st Engineer Battalion and the 51st Engineer Battalion, who are involved in much of the early fighting for back there. Their two commanders, well, Lieutenant Colonel Pergrin was for the 291st, and he was with that unit from its original organization in Camp Swift, Texas. Colonel Frazier actually ended up taking over command once his unit, the 51st, got to France. Interesting with the 51st is they were designated to come over in early '43. They were sent down to Hampton Roads, Virginia, to load on ships. Their equipment was sent to Long Beach, California. So guess where their equipment ended up? So they ended up in France with essentially no equipment at all. And actually, they were fortunate. They could have just been converted to infantry, because we certainly trained to do that as well. But they were eventually reconfigured and sent to France. I ought to at least highlight a little bit for those of you who don't know much about engineers. We have a variety of different engineer units. We have what we call divisional combat engineers. That's the engineer companies which are attached to the hip to a particular division. They do anything and everything that division commander wants. They belong to that particular division. The next level up is what we call corps or group combat engineers. These are different engineer units which normally are not directly up in the front line. They're just behind the front line. But they are under the command of typically an engineer colonel, and he can assign them where they're needed. So you can supplement the needs of a particular division with additional engineer units. And quite often, the comment down there, we had bridge companies, often separate companies specialized in constructing either float bridging or fixed bridging. And then you have the construction engineers, the really heavyweight guys. You know, these are the ones who you'd think could build highways. You see them with big scrapers, you know, huge cranes and stuff. And they even port construction engineers. And during World War II, we actually had railroad and pipeline engineers. We don't anymore. I don't think we even have port construction engineers. We kind of hire someone to do that work. Well, if you looked at a typical combat engineer unit trundling down the highway, you would think they were just a general contractor with guns. And this configuration was typical for a World War II combat engineer. This was exactly the unit structure I had when I served as a combat engineer company in Vietnam, and then ultimately served with the combat battalion in Germany. We looked exactly like this. And it was just basic construction equipment. Now, I wouldn't even recognize a combat engineer unit. You know, the equipment has changed so much and become much more armored and just quite something. We had basic pioneer tools, chainsaws, demolition kits, all the basic stuff that would allow you to kind of ruin your day if you're kind of out there wanting to get in someone's way. But we also, if you look to the right, we didn't have a lot of heavy weapons. You know, engineers are not configured to fight in the same way as infantry. We just don't have, you know, the heavy weapon power, mortars, you know, and things that an infantry unit would have. But interesting enough, when you look back at them, you could really do quite a lot. in the defense, just looking at it, we plant mines everywhere. We blow bridges. We can blow down trees in such a way that they kind of interconnect with each other and makes it almost impossible to clear out. We can push rubble into piles. We build wire, obstacles. And we actually, we can serve as infantry, primarily doing roadblocks and things like that. And then on the offense, you're just doing the opposite. And the last thing I would just kind of highlight down below, the lower two right ones reflects, well, let's see, building dry span bridges. The middle one down there is a Bailey Bridge, first designed by the British engineer Donald Bailey. Engineers hate it, but it's the one type of bridging that you can basically build with manpower. You don't need a crane for many of the things. And for most bridging, you can assemble it, push it across the span, and depending how many layers or you want to add to it, you can actually make it strong enough to carry a train across. And then certainly float bridging. They did a lot of that. Looking at the 291st Engineers, they're the first ones who got to Normandy, and they landed almost within a week after D-Day. And they were there for the whole time, attached to First Army. And basically, you can see the kind of missions that they did. And when you're an engineer, you're kind of always busy. Infantry and stuff are very important, but once you get into battle, you kind of withdraw and have to reconfigure yourself. The engineers, you basically just continued going. And there's always something that you needed to do. And this, again, just shows the versatile Bailey bridge set. And we still use it today. We trained extensively with that. In fact, when I was living in Italy in the late 50s, early 60s, you could still see Bailey bridges in many of the mountain towns that, the roads were there connected. And once you built it, you just kind of weld the bolts in place, and it's not going to go anywhere. And in fact, recently, I was over at Grand Lake, and they were replacing a section of a bridge area. And I'll swear the temporary bridge looked exactly like a Bailey Bridge. And it's just, they have more modern versions of them now, but I could recognize that anywhere. And again, you could make it under, short spans. You can make them under long spans. And, what they kind of say is we did so well at destroying every cotton-picking bridge in France, in the preparation for D-Day. Now you had to replace all of them. And so, the engineers were more than busy having to do that. Now, where are we? October to December. Don gave you a good overview of kind of the rush up to the border. We had to kind of stop around October and November. We were just running short of being able to provide supplies. This kind of shows a couple things. This is the northern sector. This is kind of the area where Don's talked about the Elsenborn Ridge. It was kind of a higher elevation area. This reflects the border. So we were all up along through here. And this is kind of where Don was talking about the area where that infantry platoon held up things. A couple items to note here is what I highlighted in blue. These are critical rivers, not very big, and I'll show you a picture of them coming through the Amblev, the Wash here, the Somme River coming up, Liane Creek, and again, the Meuse and everything is way off to the left still. So when you look at this, this looks like a large area, but from the border to Trois Points, which we'll talk about some more, the distance there is probably no more than 10 miles. So straight line, quite different along the roads. So the topography, that was a challenge, certainly for on the offense. The picture on the left shows a typical village, actually Houffalize, which was kind of way into, north of Bastogne. But what you end up seeing is the topography there, many rolling valleys, quite wooded in the hills. At the base of every valley, you literally had either a stream or a small river coming through. None very big, but over the course of centuries, they were all structured such that you had very sharp banks to keep from flooding. You had many small bridges, mostly wood, but the major little towns and everything had kind of massive stone bridges that had been built for a long period of time. The other thing too, and you're right, much of the construction, whether you're talking about a farmhouse or a cafe or hotel, was pretty much all in stone. So what you essentially have is every building could become a pillbox, a fortification that gave you quite a lot of protection. And then the lower right-hand corner shows the bridge at Stoffalo, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But you can see it's a massive structure. You don't blow it down with 50 pounds of TNT. Ultimately, to destroy this one, you needed 1,000 pounds. So anyway, so what happened? Where were the engineers at this point? Life was good for them. We no longer were moving constantly. You no longer were out building bridges. You actually were living. The various battalions now had their company split up all across this area in different little towns. They were running sawmills, creating timber and stuff that we needed for timber bridges, we needed for fortifications, we needed just to provide temporary protection for our soldiers. So the platoons and the soldiers were living in the little towns, quite often living in people's homes, farmhouses, and stuff. And so you went out during the day, you were going through the areas there, and you were running sawmills. And then at night you kind of came back and had a nice warm bed, quite often the little cafes there. What was pointed out is when you were back down in this area, this was area that was traditionally Belgium, and you were very much welcomed by the people. Once you got up nearer the border, up along in here, this was an area that traditionally belonged to Germany for a long period of time, and after World War II was given to the Belgium. So there's great affinity still, for Germany. Well, the initial actions. The engineers were spread out all over the place. And what happened is initially, no one knew kind of what was going on. There was all sorts, let me see, go back. Yeah, I ought to come back to this. December 16th, the engineers, which are always scattered out, always had to check in early morning with the battalions and stuff to see what was going on. Well, very quickly, the morning of the 16th, they lost all landline and radio communications. They kind of recognized that they were hearing rumblings off to the east there, and they began to report they were seeing visible aircraft of our aircraft attacking something or another, and some were getting shot down. And then all of a sudden, Malmedy was one of our major locations here. Okay, Malmedy, and we'll see Stofflot, Trois Points, La Glaise. These are going to be kind of our focus. But what we're beginning to see is suddenly you're getting a tremendous amount of traffic coming from the west. Not very organized, but with all sorts of claiming that the Germans were breaking through and everything. You also were beginning reports of vehicles with U.S. markings, but the people on their uniforms looked a little strange. and whenever you approached them, they quickly scooted off. And this was the group of Sikorskis, specialized, was supposed to be a combat brigade, dressed up in U.S. soldiers' uniforms with the idea of creating havoc in the background. And we think they actually were successful. So what essentially happened is along these critical river areas where we had major bridges and stuff, there were no combat units here anymore. They either were withdrawing from the east because of the initial attack. First Army, the 2nd Infantry Division and 99th were up here and quite busy. But as part of First Army, they were beginning to send an armor unit down here to reinforce the area around St. Vith. So essentially the engineers were told, you stay in place, you put in roadblocks, and essentially you stay in those locations until you're relieved. And so I think Don's already talked a little bit about this, Lieutenant Colonel Piper's spearhead, which again came through the Losham Gap here. And he was pretty much directed on certain routes. Some of them were hard top, some of them were more soft type areas. This again, what we call the Elsenborn Ridge. The 12th Panzers here were supposed to have been able to seize that. But because of the strong resistance, they kind of ended up being pushed down south, and again, which impacted Piper's drive. He was pushing to get towards Stavlot. And this kind of shows it again. And the four major things that we'll at least be mentioning is the defense, the engineers did a Malmedy, Stavlot, and Trois Points, and ultimately the Habanot Bridge. Lieutenant Colonel Pergren was sent to Malmedy to organize the engineer defense for that particular. At that point, they didn't know if Piper or anyone was going to come. But essentially what this map just shows you, the number of different little roadblocks and stuff that were set up. Again, the roadblocks maybe only had 4 or 5 engineers there. They had nothing heavier than a bazooka, a bunch of anti-tank mines and stuff. But you set up all these various little roadblocks, and you just kind of waited to see what was happening. At the same time, you still had this kind of constant flow of equipment, units and stuff, some still coming from the front, and others now beginning to move down toward the St. Vith area. So it was really quite confusing. Actually, it was the engineers, the 291st, which first reported the Malmedy massacre. Colonel Pergren was in Malmedy at the time, and this was when B Company, the 285th Artillery Battalion, was coming through. They had directions to get to St. Vith. At that point, they kind of came through Malmedy. The company commander actually talked with Colonel Pergren. He told him what he knew about what was going on, and essentially it indicated he had reports that German forces were just slightly to the east of this kind of area. But they felt they had to follow their orders to get to St. Vith, and the most direct route took them essentially from Malmedy down through N23 to what was called Five Corners at this point, and then continue on down towards St. Vith. And unfortunately what happened is this is around 11:30, they went ahead and took off, and By the time they got to this point here, it was just about the time that an element of Piper's group was coming across this way. They were heading, actually, to head off that. This was just an open field. So as soon as they saw the artillery company there, with not a lot of heavy weapons themselves, they essentially shot up the entire formation. They surrendered, and then supposedly another group came by from the SS with directions to kill everybody, and 85 of them were killed. Colonel Peregrine and the 291st were essentially the only ones organized back in Malmedy. They kind of heard this and sent out, in fact, Colonel Peregrine came out with a small group to check things out, kind of came back up through the woods area. And while they were trying to ascertain what's going on, they could certainly see what appeared to be, a lot of bodies down here. 5 soldiers came just scrambling out of the woods there, actually kind of from a ditch, just totally almost incoherent, but explained what had happened. Colonel Peregrine brought them back to Malmedy, interviewed them, and sent a very detailed message back to First Army and Spog, General Hodges. And that's where the word got out about the Malmedy massacre. The engineers sent other groups out and were able to bring back other soldiers, who were still alive. Or
How many were killed?
85 is cited.
How many survived?
I'm trying to remember the number. It was a company, so a total company would have been about 160. So less than half from that. Well, interesting. Even though they obviously had forces and were fairly close, a straight shot to Malmedy, they didn't head to Malmedy. Piper's group then swerved off to the left and headed to Stavlat. Main reason I could kind of see for that is I think they figured Malmedy probably at that point was being more reinforced. Stavlat was much nearer in the direction they needed to head toward the Meuse River bridges. So again, what happened there is they just continued on with the push. Stavlat was important because there was that heavy big bridge there, which would be able to take armor units across. And this was, again, the Amblev River. Not that it was super big, but the armor just couldn't really cross the steep banks that typically were part of the river. The other thing, too, for some reason or other, there were no engineer units attached to Piper's command. He asked for them, but Hitler or some senior people said, no, you don't need them, because you're going to capture the bridges before they know what to do. Well, they got to Stavlat. Again, they were supposed to be there by mid-afternoon the first day. This was now 7 o'clock at night, and just the first elements were approaching it. Why? Because they were held up, by the tenacious efforts by, the INR platoon and others. And the roads just were hard. And nothing, leads more toward confusion than a lot of units on a series of fairly narrow roads. Well, they arrived right about here. There's the bridge, and that picture I showed you earlier. That's what they needed to capture. But by the time they got to this point here, we had set up, actually it was just a squad level, our C Company 291st roadblock here, and there were some others along through there. And at that point, they were pretty much kind of exhausted. They could see down into the town, and there were a lot of lights and stuff going on. Not because there was any great organization going on. You just had still the flow of traffic trying to either flee from the front or bringing in reinforcements somewhere. So Private Goldstein was set out alone at a little like roadblock right here to provide any early warning. You had, again, mines and machine guns here. And as the first tank rolled up, he said he didn't realize, gave it much thought, but he stood up and said, "I'll halt." And he said, as soon as he said that, all hell broke loose. You know, and so fortunately he wasn't hit, but you can kind of see he scrambled his way back. But it was just enough that kind of, you know, at that point the German commander of that particular unit was kind of exhausted, I think, themselves, and just said, well, maybe we'd better wait. Piper wasn't there. He was probably 10 miles back, well, 5 miles back, you know, in the traffic jams that were there. And so they halted for the night. If they had just kept going at that point, they could have readily seized not only the bridge, but the town of Stavelot. During the 12 hours, you know, well, less than that, at that point, they were able to bring in an armored infantry unit to help kind of put up some defenses within the town, and an additional engineer unit, the C Company, the 202nd, came in to wire the bridge. However, by early the next morning, actually starting about 6 o'clock, Piper started the effort to kind of seize the bridge in the town. Started with an artillery barrage a bit of the town, and then started his tanks forward and just said, keep going. And at that point, we're not certain what happened, but the bridge didn't blow. Some of that was, I think, confusion as to who was actually in command finally to give the final order. But the tanks came barreling down the hill. It was quite icy. They couldn't really control themselves, but along with that, it just kind of pushed them straight across the bridge into the town. And the infantry came along very quickly behind them. However, you could see here, which was actually quite fortunate for the Allies, is they came barreling into here, this part of the town. Again, all the buildings are stone. You did have infantry and stuff all around firing at them, and kind of convinced them they couldn't afford to spend time trying to seize the rest of the town. Let's get on this side road here, which now heads down toward Trois Points. And that's exactly what they did. But look at what was up here. There was a huge gas dump of just hundreds and hundreds of 5-gallon jerry cans of diesel fuel, gasoline, and stuff. And that's exactly what they needed. The biggest problem for Piper along this, even though he had his tanks to include Tiger tanks, they were a glutton for using up gasoline and diesel fuel. And all along the way, his biggest threat was if he didn't get some, refuel stocks from somewhere, sooner or later, they were not going to be able to get to the Meuse River bridges.
Can I ask you?
Yeah.
One of the reasons why you wouldn't want to blow up a bridge sometimes is in case you needed it to return to a state.
Right, and that's what engineers are for. We blow it up when you need to, and then we rebuild it, when suddenly we need it. And yes, but in this case, it was more important to blow it up. Because what this did is now it got a Piper across one of the major barriers he had, and that was the Ambulative River. Now, as they continued on down toward Trois Points, that was going to become critical, because if he could seize the bridges there, this provided you the most direct route toward the Meuse River bridges, which was what they were supposed to do. They could kind of come up this way towards Stoumont and again over, but the distance was much longer. And at this point in time, gasoline was getting to be a major problem for his tanks. It also, we still was in period, we're only talking 2 days now. You know, we're now talking about the 16th, you know, the attack started. The 17th, they moved in down toward Malmedy. So we're now talking about toward the 18th. And this is the battle for Trois Points. Again, this was a critical location, and there were no combat units there at all. The only units there was C Company of the 51st Engineers and a platoon from C Company of the 291st. There was nothing else. So essentially, each one of those bridges were assigned to a different, the engineer guys, and they went ahead and mined them and also set up a little roadblock along the way. I don't know if this one showed it. We had kind of a roadblock here, which didn't do much to stop them. But, you know, you can kind of see there, this bridge is critical for the Amblev. You have other bridges down through here and even within town. Well, okay. Essentially, what happened for the next total day is the engineers either fought off his advance, strictly using the weapons they had, putting out mines for roadblocks, and then when it became necessary, they blew the bridge. And the critical bridges here were, again, if he needed to be able to get across the Amblev Bridge there, and even then, you still had to come across this bridge, which would then get you further on. But the engineers were the only ones there at that time. At one point, by around the 18th, 19th, the first elements of the 82nd Airborne showed up to help reinforce that. Because he couldn't get across at Trois Points, his next possible effort he could go was up toward La Gliese, and there's a road which kind of came down here toward Habermont, and there was a bridge across across the, I'm trying to remember, I guess it's the continuation of the Somme. And so that was the next thing he kind of went to. And to kind of give you an idea what it was like. Yeah.
Directly along the route to the Meuse River, Piper had to cross the bridge at the end bridge. In anticipation of this, Colonel Ferber's S3, Major Lamp, ordered Lieutenant Edelstein and his platoon of Company A to prepare the bridge for demolition. The bridge was 180 feet long. It had been blown by the Germans once before, during their retreat into the Siegfried line. The 291st had rebuilt it as a timber trestle bridge. Now, we prepared to destroy it again. It was 3:30 in the afternoon of the 18th. The bridge was prepared with 2,500 pounds of explosive and defended by Lieutenant Edelstein and 22 men. At 4:15, a group of civilians on bicycles approached the bridge and warned Edelstein's men that the Germans were approaching. The men were instructed not to blow the bridge until the lead tank was on it. An emergency charge was prepared in case the first one didn't go off. So Sergeant Chapin, on the explosive device in the guard shelter for the bridge, held off the explosion. He didn't have long to wait. Within minutes, Piper's tanks approached the position. As the lead tank moved onto the bridge, Chapin let it go. bridge disappeared in a geyser of timber, dirt, and rocks. The second charge wasn't necessary. The surrounding area was very swampy. There was no opportunity for heavy armor to cross or ford the creek. He then tried to get a couple of small half-tracks across the bridge at Forge, and we were ready for that move too. Sergeant Billington and Johnny Rondinell of Lieutenant Edelstein's platoon pulled daisy-chain mines across the roads as the half-tracks approached. And up they went. Piper was stopped cold. The end creek marked the furthest penetration of his armored column during the Battle of the Bulge. After the war, when Piper was asked what he thought when we stopped him at the end creek, he said, "All I could do was pound my knee and scream, 'The damned engineers, the damned engineers.'" So was born the name of which we will forever be proud, the damned engineers.
So that, as far as the Piper could get at that point. By then, the skies were beginning to clear, and what he had to do then was they were trying to attack up through Stowmont, but by then, other forces were beginning to come down. Both, we had the 82nd Airborne now and the 30th Infantry Division. And again, he was running out of fuel and also food. So by the 21st, Stavelot had been recaptured by the 30th Infantry Division, and Trois Points now had been reinforced by elements of the 82nd. So the engineers were kind of relieved of the major defensive works they had to do. You still had an attempt by the Germans to seize Malmedy as a way that Piper might have been able to extract his forces. But it turns out that didn't go as well. And also by then, they were getting pounded by our air forces. The skies had cleared, around this time, at Bastogne, we were able to resupply them. And again, by the 24th, Piper had to essentially abandon his equipment just a little bit, little east of La Glaise, and just have his men try and infiltrate back across the Ambelev River back to where German forces were. General Gavin, when they finally relieved the engineers, had a nice comment. He commended the engineer units who held the ground so stubbornly at Malmedy, Stavelot, and Trois Points as effective as a good combat division. And I'd have to agree with him for that. For the time period, they could have not have held forever, but they could have held it up enough that we could have gotten the key reinforcements there. And just, at that point, by the 24th, it was clear, a German attack was not going to work. Anyone who's kind of done any sort of history looking at it, on the 20th of December, Eisenhower assigned First Army to Field Marshal Montgomery. That created quite a lot of turmoil within our side, mainly because if we kind of looked at this, area, First Army was operating up in this area. Third Army and the rest of our forces were kind of down here, and you were separated. And in between, you had Montgomery with his forces there. So, that was done for a variety of reasons. By the 26th of December, we're seeing the lead element of Patton's forces finally get to Bastogne. And you can kind of see by 16 January, the First Army and Third Army meet at the little town of Houffalize, which basically was the center of the Bulge. And officially, by the end of January, we're saying that the Battle of the Bulge was officially ended. I'd like to give a little postscript. In 1995, the town of Houffalize invited the members of Second Army and Third Army to come back for kind of a reunion to celebrate the 50th anniversary at that time of the Battle of the Bulge. It was the kind of what they called it to celebrate the second liberation of the, from the Germans on the 16th of January. And the elements that were involved was from First Army, the 334th Infantry Regiment, and the 84th coming down from the north, and the Third Army, 41st Armored Cavalry Recon Squadron from the 11th Armored Division. The interest there was my father-in-law headed that recon unit from the 11th Armored Division. And the picture of him on the left, and in 45, and then in his final assignment in Vietnam as a brigadier general. And the link-up occurred the morning of the 16th, and when you approach Houffalize, there the images, the town was utterly destroyed from the fighting. And that was just myself on the left, Mike Green, my father-in-law's son, Larry Green, grandson, and General Green. And those were just the group of the people who came back. It was really quite a nice little celebration offered by the town. And they have a nice little memorial in the center of town honoring the 11th Armored Division, and a memorial for the Houffalize citizens who lost their lives. Interestingly, 200 of them lost their lives during the final fighting there. And we attended a nice ceremony in the Catholic Church, and they read off the names of everybody. And I just happened to ask someone, how did they die? And it turns out that we had sent a group of bombers over to bomb the bridge that was just to the right of the church, and we hit the church. And that's where everyone went, figuring, you'd be safe there. But again, the thing was, there was never any mention of that by anyone. And afterwards, there was a reception for everyone who came, and everyone was given little cards with some heartfelt messages on it. Like this one, it says, "Thank you and welcome to Belgium. You are the best men in the world." I always have trouble reading it. "You gave your blood and your courage for liberty in December of '44. And it goes on, and there's another one. "Dear American veteran, in this moment of great emotion, I can't forget that you had many courage to fight against the enemy during the winter of '44, '45 in the snow and the fire of the bloody Battle of the Bulge. To me, it's a great honor to say I'm a child of your sacrifice." So, whatever we say, the Europeans, and particularly in Belgium and any area that the Germans had occupied, recognize the sacrifice our young soldiers made for back then. So anyway, that's it, but thank you very much for joining us. Yes.
I wanted to ask, of the attendees here, whose father or relative fought in the Battle of the Bulge?
Oh, yeah, we have several. Could you say what unit? He was 101st Airborne, so that would have been